My name's Christine Gerard and I'm the director of Torch, and welcome to Book at Lunchtime. So today we will be discussing Adam Smyth's The Bookmakers, a history of the book in 18 Remarkable Lives. For those of you who are new to Torch and who haven't been here before, Book at Lunchtime is one of our longest standing flagship events. We have films of every book featured going back to 2013. And so Book at Lunchtime, as it enters 2025, has a long heritage. So please do visit our website and YouTube channel to watch all of our previous Book at Lunchtime's discussions. There are over 100, which you can see. So today we're really pleased to welcome Professor Adam Smyth from the English faculty and also Professor Abigail Williams and Professor Ben Higgins. I'm delighted, I feel as though I'm in home territory here actually. These are my very close colleagues from both the faculty and my college and the division. So this is a real treat for me and it's great to see so many of you here. And we're here to discuss Adam's highly acclaimed book, The Bookmakers. The reviews of this book have been absolutely outstanding. I would like to just quote from a few. One of them in the Financial Times was very perceptive, and it wrote, The Bookmakers explores the lives of a handful of men and women who each contributed something distinctive to the history of the book. The story they collectively tell is not one of continuous technological improvement, but rather a cyclical drama of making and remaking of the idea of the book itself. I find it interesting that some of the reviewers were prone to puns. I don't know what there is about the book that kind of makes people want to pun. I noticed that the FT said that this was a fascinating book that speaks volumes. And that the Guardian said that it was bound to be brilliant, which, yeah. But there's one of the strands of the review analysis that I think is recurrent and which interests me is there's quite a sort of lyrical response to this book. And I feel that this is a testament actually to Adam's engagement with the human and to the incredibly readable but beautiful style of his writing. This really is the loveliest of books, and you will never take it for granted, never take for granted reading a physical copy again. Vivid and often surprising, the charm of The Bookmakers comes from its interest in wear and tear, blunders and errata, the spontaneous and the scrappy, the residual and the recycled, and in edges of pages and bindings, society and taste. So I'm really delighted that we can find out more about this book today, and I will hand over to my colleagues. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Christine. My name's Abby Williams. I'm Professor of 18th Century Studies in the Faculty of English, and I also have a role in the Humanities Division here as the Head of Research and Innovation. And I am delighted to be here on this panel with Adam, who, as Christine has said, is the author of The Bookmakers, also of 3 other major monographs: Material Texts in Early Modern England, which came out in 2018, Autobiography in Early Modern England, which came out in 2010, and Profit and Delight, Printed Miscellanies in England, which came out in 2004. And Adam's self-description on his webpage says that he's interested in thinking about books and literature in new ways and thinking of creative ways of presenting his work and of working in general, usually involving collaboration, which seems to invite a whole load of questions about how you write and how you situate your work. I hope we can talk about some of those. Ben Higgins is at Lady Margaret Hall. He's Career Development Fellow in English Literature. And his first book, Shakespeare's Syndicate, came out with OUP in 2022. He's also interested in the material qualities of books and the kind of cultures of production around them. And Shakespeare's Syndicate is really about how the book trade created Shakespeare's first folio. He's currently working on a project around literature in space in the early modern period. Okay, so over to you, Adam.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's really a treat to be here, and thank you for coming. Thank you for Christine and Abby and Ben being here with me for this hour. It's really nice to have three friends doing this. Thanks to John for setting it up. It's a real treat. As lots of you know, as all of you know, writing a book is, it's an overwhelmingly solitary thing where you're communing with books or maybe authors on your own, and then you publish it, and rather than the fanfare and the trumpet, there's a launch, and then you go back to your emails and you carry on with your life. So it's really nice to have a moment to be able to think about the bookmakers. And perhaps, shall I read a little bit from the intro? Is that suitable? Yeah. And then we can talk about it. I mean, the broad aim of the book is to really do two things. One is to trace the long history of print from about 1480 or so to today, and the ways in which the printed book or printed non-book has taken different forms through time. And so I hope by the end of it, the book is both recognizably familiar to you as a technology that you know how to use, but also quite contingent. It did different things at different points in history. So there's a big arc there about print. And then within there are a smaller series of arcs which are biographical, which are lives of men and women who responded to their particular moment with success or failure or ambition or getting it 60% right, and produced a series of fascinating kind of bookish or book-like or non-book objects. So I was trying to think about that double scale. Anyway, I'll read a couple of pages from the beginning and then we can go from there. This is from the very start, and I have to wear my glasses. This is from the intro where I'm telling you what this book is going to be. This is a book about books and the people who made them. It's about grand 2-volume folio Bibles and quickly Xeroxed 2020 zines and the many books in between. It's about the lives that brought these forms variously wondrous, strange, familiar, new, into being. It's about fragments of the earliest 15th century books that only barely survive, and 18th century volumes of such typographical elegance and calm that they sailed forth serenely, as one observing historian put it, to astonish all the librarians of Europe. It's about books whose perfection makes us approach them with reverential care. Look at the inking, look at the binding, feel the paper. And books covered with the scribbled doodlings of readers heckling from the long ago past. Here is a moment when the history of a book came alive. I'm in the Bodleian Library, a couple of hundred yards away, working my way through a pile of big folio volumes written by the magnificently singular Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, 1623 to 73. Cavendish is fascinating for all kinds of reasons, not least as a scientist, the first woman to attend a Royal Society meeting, and as the inventor of something like science fiction. Her Blazing World from 1666 describes a young woman invading the world with an army of talking animals and submarines pulled by fishmen. Cavendish was also what we'd call an early modern celebrity. The whole story of this lady is a romance, wrote Samuel Pepys in 1667, after spending a fruitless day trying to catch a glimpse of her coach. On title pages, she styled herself thrice noble, illustrious and excellent princess. Pepys imagined her footmen in velvet coats and herself in an antique dress, and he fixated on an image of Cavendish bowing from her box in the theatre after a performance of her play The Humorous Lovers. So, I'm in the Bodleian and I'm midway through Cavendish's Poems and Fancies from 1664, when in the margins of a page I see a dark smudge. I look closer, it is ink. Closer still, a blurred fingerprint. At least I think that's what it is. Parts of the swirling lines just about visible. This is a fingerprint of the man who printed the book in 1664, an accidental left behind signature. And for a moment, as if by lightning, the process of this book's production is lit up. The print shop of William Wilson in 1664, the noise and the paper windows and the stink, a pressman plucking sheets still wet with ink from the press and, before hanging them to dry on high strings running across the room, touching mistakenly an inky finger to the margin of the sheet which, after drying, folding, stitching and binding, was acquired by the Bodleian and which, after a gap of 359 years, I am peering at now. That fingerprint doesn't summon into being the nameless print shop worker who held the page I'm looking at, but it does let me see Cavendish's book for what it is, a physical object made by a little group of individuals at a particular time. Books tell all kinds of stories, romances, tragedies, comedies. But if we learn to read the material signs correctly, books can tell us the story of their own making too. Okay, I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think you can get a sense from that reading of how evocative this book is in conjuring moments of discovery, moments of creation. That's one of the things I really loved about it. I'm interested in the fact that you've chosen to write a history of the book through lives, and what that does for our sense of the development of a material form, that it's through its makers rather than aligning the forms themselves. Who are the heroes of this? Like, are the books the heroes or are the makers? What did that feel like as a sort of evaluation of that story?
Yeah, that's such a great question. You're right. So there's a more familiar version of this kind of book, I guess, which is a history of technology, a kind of unpeopled history of technology, which talks about forms of presses and paper-making machines, not as expressions of human creativity, but as technologies that silently or noisily churn out the thing without people being present. And that wasn't the kind of story I wanted to tell. So I wanted to tell the story of technology, but to see it as a human product, and to see it as the work of men and women situated in time. As for who are the heroes, that's really a great question. Is it the people or is it the book? Part of the answer to that is about time and the scale and the temporality of those two categories. So the people that I talk about are fascinating to me and compelling to me, sometimes reachable, but sometimes not. The earliest ones are sort of traces that you can't quite get to. The later ones, like Nancy Cunard, say, are much more realisable. But those figures are contingent. That is, they exist at a particular time for a couple of decades or 10 years. They make books and they're a product of their family and their life and their relationship. And I wanted to try and see how they were embedded as far as I could. But then I love the sense of books as objects which move through time, which once made... I mean, one way to think about a book is it's printed in 1492 or 1701 or 1928. But another is to think about the long life of the book as it moves, not serenely, but moves through time from its moment of printing through decades and centuries to reach us now. And I love that sense of the Cavendish book that I was just talking about as an object which existed in front of me in 2023 when I was reading it, but had existed at every moment since 1664 as well. And that kind of powerful clash between the contingency of the lives and then the kind of longue durée of the book I find very interesting. And they're both kinds of hero, but they're just working on different time frames, I think, I would say.
It's interesting what you say here about the knowability, the variable knowability of the characters that you're looking at, from Wynkin de Worde at the beginning through to the creators of zines at the end. There's a lot more information that you can retrieve from some of those people. And I think you do that really adroitly. It feels like a coherent story, even though I know that you're dealing with really disparate forms of evidence. I think one of the things that makes that possible, that transition between the very little known to the very well known, is the role of the imagination, is what you kind of conjure in the way that you write. So you start off with this very empirical moment, don't you? The fingerprint. I mean, the bit that you read is about finding a thing and then using that distinct piece of evidence to unpack a story. But elsewhere in the book, you are really imagining scenes that you can't have known. There's a bit in the Bodleian where you're talking about people pulling back their chairs and sitting. You're recreating a kind
Making
of.
it up.
I didn't say that. But you are. Yeah. And what is the relationship for you between how did you feel about the making it up? Because it's not what we do as scholars most of the time. And if we do, we pretend we're not doing it.
Yeah, we do generally do that. That's a great question. Yeah, so it's the earlier lives. So Wynkin de Worde, to some degree in the late 15th century, but particularly the binder I talk about, early 17th century binder called William Wildgoose, Oxford binder, who binds Shakespeare's first folio, but lots of other things as well, not only that. And there are almost no biographical traces that he leaves behind beyond his spectacular name. And in fact, around Oxford at that time, there were loads and loads of people called Wildgoose. There seems to be an extended family of wild geese. In his case, the books are the evidence of him. And the powerful impression of reaching for him but not getting him is of, entering his print shop, his binder shop, and he's just left. He's not there, he's gone, and the door's swinging and the books are there, and that's all you've got to deal with. So in those early stories, I rely on the books for that sense of presence. And I am always really fascinated with the failed reach for a life, the attempt to grasp a biography that isn't reachable, and what happens in that reaching. In terms of making things up, well, I would say, I mean, that's how I described it, which is a silly way to describe it, obviously, but it's kind of situated speculation.
Yeah, obviously that's totally different, right?
It is different. So, for example, so Wink and the Words print shop, which is on Fleet Street, is now an Itsu. But you can go there and you can see it. And we also have lots of inventories, not of his own print shop, but of other shops around there at the time, which list the books and the presses and the conditions. And we know a lot about how a press would have worked, the smell of it and the sound of it. I tried to pour all that into an account of what it would be like based on other accounts that we have. I mean, I think traditionally bibliography book history has been an empirical pursuit and has been committed to robust evidence that you can kick your foot against. And that's fine and good, except that at a certain point you kind of end up repeating the same stories or lamenting the same absences and not doing anything about it. And there's been a fascinating move recently towards a more creative approach to archives, which isn't it's not letting go of rigor or care, but it's thinking about the possibilities that archival traces hold rather than provable facts. Because at certain points, I think it becomes perverse to only repeat the claim you can definitely say, rather than thinking about what it might mean. I think.
So you're thinking about the stuff you can kick your feet against, as you say, and what you can't. And you talked about the kind of sound and the smell of being in a workshop. So it seems like the haptic or the sensory experience of printing and bookmaking is important to you here. How far is that informed by your own practice?
So, well, a lot. So if I'm thinking about kind of the origin points of this book, one is my often bungled attempt to learn how to print. So about 10 years ago, I'm teaching literature here. I wanted to learn more about printing and have some hands-on experiences. So I bought a Model 4 iron press, mid-19th century press, with two friends, Jill Partington and Dennis Duncan. And we would meet, often with Abby as well, and sometimes with Ben, and try and print things. And it was a slow process of learning. And we would print short texts, because in a weekend initially we could do a sonnet. And we got interested in that. And the experiment really was in how we might think differently about text and writing if we approach it as a printer with inky fingers and lead type and composing sticks and sheets hanging on threads and so on. There's an amazing lecture which became a publication by Virginia Woolf. What do we do when we read a book? Or how should one read a book? From 1926, which is a brilliant account of the strangeness of reading and what reading is. But it's going, and she's writing it when she's learning to print, and the Hogarth press is just this emerging thing with Leonard. And you can see her vocabulary for writing about language and literature shifting, and suddenly words are piled up and distributed and reorganized and composed. And this, you could see her brilliant literary imagination being shaped by her experience of printing. So that interest in, and if you're setting a page of, as lots of you will know, setting a page of type, you're less interested in the themes or the imagery or even the narrative, and you're more interested in text as suddenly a physical object in space, which requires balance and evenness and tightness and mustn't wobble. So it was interesting to think about that conception of text while coming from literature and loving fiction and so on.
Interesting. What Adam doesn't say is the number of times on which during the letterpress printing, somebody would go, "My God, I'm glad they invented the laser printer," because it's so difficult.
Yeah. My friend Ben said, "You do realise you can buy laser printers."
I wonder if, the final thing I just wanted to say about what I like about it is how fun this book is. There's a reason why the reviewers are drawn to puns, and that's because there are so many jokes in it and moments of levity, which is absolutely not characteristic of the field of bibliography or book history, and which makes it a pleasure to read, and also I think enables some of that kind of creative space or creative thinking. It enables you to engage at a different level which doesn't presume of sort of seriousness and expertise on the part of the reader. So you can kind of go on this exploratory journey without feeling like you've already missed several levels of education to get to entry point, if that makes sense. So did that feel risky, putting that much fun in it?
No, because I was determined to enjoy writing it. That was sort of the point of the project. And slightly experiment with a slightly different register of writing. And so the jokes, such as they are,
They're brilliant.
they are brilliant, but they sort of emerge. But I was trying to think, as you're asking that question, whether there's something about the topic that produces jokes. There's something about bathos there, I think, about the kind of reaching for the life and then not reaching the life. And there's something about the book as a sort of static thing on the desk in front of you in the library, but also a thing that's journeyed for 500 years and will after we've all gone. There's something about that, and there's lots of philosophical depths to that collision, but one of them is a kind of the absurdity of the moment now of trying to do it and trying to work out what's going on or say anything in the light of that vast sort of canvas. I think maybe there's a link between that and jokes.
Brilliant. Ben, I have poked all these questions. Over to you.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks. I'm just going to tack in two things quickly before I'm going to start. My job here, I think, is just to say things that I loved about this book and to kind of draw out some lovely things, which is a total joy for me to do. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to speak to Adam's book and to Adam and Abby both for inviting me along. My favourite, I think, of the kind of punning moments of play in this book might be quite early. There's a moment where you describe the binder, William Wildgoose, the chap that binds Shakespeare's first folio, as honking around Oxford, which I thought I think kind of typifies that sort of light touch, casual humour that runs throughout this book. It's really, really nice. I wanted to just slip, before saying things that I loved about this book, I wanted to just slip in my own question, which is, so this is a book that bestows a completely loving attentiveness to the materiality of the codex form, I guess, not only the codex form. And I just wondered to what degree that informed your own decisions or influence, such as it is as an author, over the material status of this thing. I listened to, I think there was maybe about a chapter and a half of this that I actually listened to an audiobook. So I know that, Adam, you read this audiobook as well.
Yeah.
It's a kind of different instantiation of this same book. And I was also struck, if I had to locate a particular question, I suppose, there's the silk crow, which is the mark. I had to look this up. I didn't know this, but it's for anyone who's got a copy of this book. If you haven't, please do go and buy it. But it's this mark which runs throughout as a kind of ragged sort of punctuation, kind of bestowing a kind of rhythm or cadence, or I don't know. I just wondered, to what extent were you allowed to think about or consider the materiality of this?
That's such a great question, because both of us, I know, have thought a lot about, in terms of 16th, 17th century writing, about the author in the print shop or not, and Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and Thomas Nash and all these people, how present were they in bookmaking? My own experience was that I was quite, I wasn't that involved in those kind of decisions in really interesting ways. So it's published by Bodley Head, who are, a nested doll within Penguin at some level. And I wrote the text and then sent it in, and then we had a long and interesting discussion about the cover. But at a certain point, that was taken away, and then things were presented to me. And I was a voice in the room, but I was one voice in the room, definitely. I have to say, the thing I like most about this book is the cover, the UK cover. The American cover, which is actually this one, I like much less, because it's a familiar image. And also the challenge of the cover, which is this nice image, and it's done by a brilliant artist called Sarah Kirby, who was commissioned to do it. And she's worth looking up on Instagram. She's got amazing kind of lino cut stuff. Woodcut, lino cut. The challenge of the book is precisely its chronology. It's like 500 years. So how do you have an image that sometimes speaks to that? This is not a good choice. And I said, my only dealing with the American publisher was, can we please not have that image? And they wrote back saying, I'm afraid we're going with that image. Because it roots it in a moment, an early modern moment, when that's just one of the things. So I think Sarah came up with this rather brilliant way of being old and new at the same time in the image. I did ask for Baskerville type, which it is in Baskerville, because Baskerville is one of the figures, 18th century Birmingham print printer and bookmaker. That was a moment of agency for me. The audiobook was quite traumatic to do. I really hated it. It was hard to do. It took ages. It took 4 days. At the end of term, I was really tired and slightly ill. And it's just a long period of time to read a whole book and to read it slowly. And also reading out lots of chunks of Latin and languages I sort of could vaguely know, but to read them out loud was tricky. So it was a slog. I had a real respect for voiceover artists at the end of it, definitely.
A good lesson. So, as I say, I think my job here is just to say things that I loved about this book, basically. So I'm going to do that, and I've decided to pick out a few thoughts around 3 key themes, which resonated with me. The first of which has already come up, which is time. So something that struck me about, Adam, you foreground it yourself in the introduction, I think, that it's a refrain that runs throughout this book. So in some ways, this is a book that follows a fairly orthodox chronology of kind of old to new. So the kind of progression, the development from Wynkin to Word and the arrival of printing in England, in Britain, and then forwards through to things like modern day zines and artists' books in the 20th and 21st century. So there's a kind of sturdy structural commitment to progression that sort of shapes the long arc of the book. And then within that broad chronology, there are these smaller units, these riveting little biographies of these fascinating people that overlap a little bit sometimes and wander in and out occasionally of each other's chapters to some degree. So those are the kind of building blocks, I suppose, of it. So the career of the typographer John Baskerville, who's come up, for instance, is a study in slowness, of patient accumulation, creeping slowly towards perfection. So a smaller unit which is kind of gathering and becoming part of this larger story. But Adam's book is also interested in the time of books. And if there are times when that means progression, there are also moments in this book when that means resistance and a kind of obduracy and a sort of stasis, a kind of stillness. So like many aspects of book production, the methods for manufacturing type, individual bits of metal type from which books are printed, did not change hugely between the mid-15th and the mid-19th centuries. It's a huge span of time when essentially, if you began at that span of time, you could probably recognize the end, the working practices and the techniques at the end of that span of time. Edward Prince was a punch cutter. He was still cutting punches for individual sorts of type in the 1920s, just as in the 14th and 15th centuries people were. So there's a tremendous kind of consistency across that time span. The history of paper also comes up, and that's a similar kind of consistency, I think. Adam describes the history of paper as both wide-ranging and also a story of relative constancy, of the rich possibility of recognition across time. So there's something here about movement and development, and there's also something here about stillness and recognition and staying with something. Books can at other times in this be about a kind of sharper, more aggressive resistance to time. So here I'm thinking about the sorts of kind of very thoughtful, mindful slowness of the community at Little Gidding, which comes up in the chapter on Mary and Anna Collett, who spend hours, weeks, months, years cutting up individual bits of tiny individual letters and reassembling them with glue to create new things from ruined old things. Other kinds of books have the capacity to slow down time. That's again Adam's words, partly because of the intense care that's poured into their production. So I'm thinking now about the anachronistic books, which come up a little bit later in Adam's books. That's people created by people like William Morris or Thomas Cobden Sanderson at the Doves Press. Some of these books were an attempt at obliterating time. So here, the book here seems to be something again about pushing away the forces of modernity and reclaiming a past, moving backwards into a past, celebrating the slowness of manual labor and the kind of love and attentiveness that seems to require. Those books also included elements that are deliberately anachronistic, so things like printed signatures, which were a sort of code to help a binder assemble a printed book in the early modern period, but by this time, by the time of Cobden Sanderson, had become totally obsolete. You don't need those things anymore, so it's a sort of reclaimed feature from the past. Or clasps as well, so medieval clasps again, which were no longer required, but take on some kind of new meaning as this reclaimed kind of fossil or something. And then the last aspect of time I wanted to draw out is that books have a time of their own, passed down from reader to reader. So maybe something like a house or a home or a building, these things carry the narrative of their use. And I mean, this is my copy of Adam's book. It's got a coffee stain on the front. I couldn't quite tell you when that's from, but I know because I was looking through it this morning, that I can tell you that this section, which is a little sort of dimpled, is because each day I take a walk around university parks. And at some point towards the end of last year, I was doing a lunchtime lap reading this chapter on typography, and I was getting rained on. This kind of strange way that books just absorb us, and that they also get passed down. They endure, right? They stay in time and gather the traces and the spores of readerly use. So time is one refrain that came up, and I'll just say a couple of other quick ones. Another one was people, so that's a really obvious thing. These chapters are structured around individual people. I really loved in this book the tension between the individual and the community. So we get these compelling case studies of figures like Charles Mudie, the chap that creates the circulating library. Charles Mudie is one, very fascinating chap with an idea. Charles Mudie, the influence of Charles Mudie, I had no idea about before this book, but was clearly actually formidable, shaped the reading tastes and even genres and forms of writing for an entire generation. I loved in this instance also the colophon of the Doves Press books. That's a chapter towards the end of the book. The colophon, the bit of text at the book that attributes credit for the people that made the book. So we don't often see this, but the Doves Press colophon lists all of the pressmen, all of the compositors, all of the printers in this kind of roll call, generous kind of roll call of inclusion. There's a line somewhere in your book, Adam, where you talk about the invisible traces, and that was one of the most fascinating things for me about this book, was the way that you make visible those visible traces. And then the last thing that I'll just add is this is a broad thought, but the form of the book. So there's a brilliant and roving curiosity in this, which in Adam's book that is, which yes, looks at kind of orthodox forms. So for book historians, that means things like folios and quartos and octavos, but it goes way, way beyond that and looks at things like birth girdles and zines and visitors' books, paper money bills, newspapers, with just Abby used the word adroit. That seems really right to me. Adroit and nimble and roving and, yes, loving curiosity, gathering all these things into Adam's gaze. Sometimes a book is a physical form being beaten into submission by a binder's hammer. Sometimes it's decorative or imaginative. Sometimes it's symbolic or repurposed. Sometimes it's popular. Sometimes it's forgotten. Sometimes it's destroyed and cut up, as in the extra illustrations or Grangerizings of Charlotte and Alexander Sutherland, who also feature in this. But one theme I think that runs through all of those variations and kind of gathers these formal richness together is, I guess, a very human desire to kind of leave a trace, to have a technology that lets us leave a mark, to make marks and kind of bestow ourselves somewhere and have that be something that's sort of shored up and able to be passed along. So those are some of the things that I loved about this. Other quick things would be total commitment to archival industry, amazing range of documents and traces that Adam moves through and gathers up. I listed a few here: wills, inventories, printers' devices, court records, account books, annotations, redactions, fragments, diaries, parish archives, but also material things like punches, sorts of type, looking at all of these sorts of things. And also just the writing. I've long thought that Adam's writing is kind of beautiful, really elegant, so curious, very kind of welcoming and accessible, yet also very erudite. And probably finally, that I think it's a book that I think you could probably only really have written now. I think if you know Adam's work, there's a lot of Adam in here. There's a lot of earlier love of biography, of miscellaneity. There's a lot of things like Adams wrote an essay on the Little Gidding community a long time ago, 20 years ago or so. There's themes here that run throughout Adam's career, I think. And to me, this is just such a perfect distillation of your life of bibliographical interest. And I'm really grateful to you for doing it. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Ben. That's such a generous response. I really appreciate that. And recognise those things you said about time and the form of the book and people. Can I just say a couple of responses? The time, yes, you're right, there's different timescales going on. There's a linearity in the ordering of the lives, and books move through time, but exactly as you said, I'm interested in the way books push back or recall earlier moments. And Thomas Cobden Sanderson's Doves Press is the most interesting example of that. And if you look at early 20th century in Hammersmith, these beautiful anti-technology, anti-industry handmade books in relatively small print runs, beautifully printed. And if you look at them, they're just fascinating objects. They're the product of the early decades of the 20th century, and you can root them in that moment. Even as they resist modernity and technology, they're part of that moment of resistance. But they might be an edition of, say, Paradise Lost from 1667, so they're printing a mid-17th century text. But the type that they use, the Dove's Press type, which is so beautiful, is heavily based around Nicholas Jensen's 1470s Roman type, Jensen in Venice, crucial in developing Roman type that we recognise today. And I love that sense of the book as early 20th century, 1660s, 1470s Venice, and all those swirls being there at the same time. And perhaps one final point about people, and you were saying, Ben, you're right, that there are individuals, but then there are also communities, and I was interested in that. Another desire in the book was to slightly decenter the well-known roll call of bookmakers, but not completely eliminate them, because that would be unhelpful. So I tried to, as it were, turn the stage, rotate the stage. So Caxton slightly goes to the side, and in comes Wynkyn de Worde, his assistant, or Virginia Woolf goes slightly off stage and Nancy Cunard appears, or William Morris, who's such a dominant ego and presence with his beard, shifts, and then Thomas Cobden Sanderson fills the place. So I was interested. So Caxton and Woolf and Morris are all there, but they're kind of muttering in the next room, or they're kind of occasional presences. And the story's slightly different and perhaps slightly less obviously triumphant if one does that, but I think it's a helpful thing to do.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have now got about 15 minutes for questions, so that you can have your say on this book or find out more about it.
What a question, what a question. Thank you for that. There's so much there. And the book does talk, I mean, the book is about the printed book, but I do talk a little bit about digital culture, digital media, and the relationship between print and the digital. It's interesting. One of the nicest things about publishing this book has been the moment, which began about 6 months ago, and I'm sort of in the middle of it now, of receiving letters from readers, and sometimes emails, but overwhelmingly, I haven't had one with wax. Well, overwhelmingly handwritten letters. I had a box arrive last week of a collection of secondhand used copies of young adult fiction, fantasy fiction, each of which had some element of book making in it that they'd curated and sent in with 2 different letters. Read this one first, read this one second. Lots of quite personal things. My husband, who died last year, was a printer. This is a bit of his type. It's drawn out very interesting responses. So the book has prompted an encounter with the physical. I mean, I don't think I don't think I would frame it as the digital triumphing over print. I don't think print and the physical book is a dead or near dead technology. If I go to my desk at home, there's a drawer full of floppy disks with my dissertation on that I can't read anymore on any computer. If you go to the British Library, there's a great room which is an archival space of dead, once celebrated media technologies, the Laserdisc, the Betamax video, the PDA, etc. And they brilliantly keep these bits of hardware, because they know in the future, when some writer who isn't yet born or is young now and has some text that's in a format that can't be read anymore, they'll still have the. So I think it's hard to predict where the digital and the print will rest. I don't think there's a Darwinian struggle going on. I think the digital is super short term thus far, and our kind of utopian ideas of permanent archival storage, I don't think there's evidence to suggest that's going to happen. Not least the British Library hijacked recently, where they got control of the servers, and we've lost stuff, data, text, and images. If you hold up a copy of the Gutenberg Bible that was printed in 1455 today, you can see the Bunch of Greats watermark alive now. So this is a book that's as it was 500 years ago, whereas my PhD probably, thankfully, is locked on these floppy disks. So it is about print, and it's about a celebration about print. I'm trying to show the capacities that print has, but it's not coming out of a spirit of a cry uttered in retreat. I think print and digital is, it's still unclear how that's going to go. The other way to answer that question is to look to historical precedent and what happens when earlier media technologies change and there's a revolutionary shift. And if we look back to the 15th century when print was the new form and spread massive anxieties about there being too many books, is something Ben's thought about a lot. Print led to too much stuff. Its relationship with manuscript was a kind of hybridity. I mean, early printed books encouraged handwritten interventions. The first major printed texts were indulgences, which you filled out by hand when you went to church. So I think if history can give us a kind of model for what happens when new media technologies clash, it's hybridity, and it's more complex than a Darwinian sort of struggle where one defeats the other. Yeah, and I have a phone. I hate my phone, but I have a phone. Yes. Yeah, but I'm not trying to stop digital technology. I just don't think it's as good as an ebook. I think if you read it as an ebook, it'll be fine. But I think it's the sense the sense you would have from a book, from reading this physical book, would be richer. I think the kind of transactional spirit of ebooks, at least as far as I feel them to be. So I'm not. Yeah. Thanks for your question. That's a good. Send me a letter. There's a really interesting publisher in London called Visual Editions, who produce produce beautiful, spectacular printed books. They did Tree of Codes and they did Tristram Shandy in very interesting. And then they started making digital books and trying to think of the digital not as a surrogate for the physical book, but as offering a different relationship to text. So it may be the people who run Visual Editions could be, possibly, they're interesting. If it was someone else, it would probably be Nicholas Jensen, who I mentioned as this Venetian typographer, printer, publisher, about whom, even though it's the 1470s, we know a little bit. And there's a very interesting story about him as someone who used to cut coins and work at a mint, and then in France, and then word spread of Mainz and Gutenberg and this new technology, and he was dispatched to investigate what was going on as this coin cutter metal worker, and seems to have acquired some knowledge of that and then brought that back and moved to Venice and started producing this incredible Roman type, which spread across northern Italy and then across Europe, sort of mediated, but still with us today. So maybe Nicholas Jensen, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think I'm, for good or for bad, even my academic work is relatively informal in tone. So, and when I first started this book, I thought of it, my initial way of thinking about it, because it's quite a big project and it began in lockdown, the writing, I thought of each chapter as something like, kind of a London Review of Books piece, which I sometimes write for them. So it's like a kind of 3,000 word, that sort of tone of people who are interested but not specialists. So that's what I was aiming for. I suppose the quality that I felt able to articulate that sometimes in scholarly discourse one needs to suppress is enthusiasm and kind of passion and excitement, which I don't think, I don't think gets in the way of rigor and thought and judgment. I mean, that would be the doubt about it in scholarly writing. In fact, the opposite. I think it has a dynamism that can open things up in interesting ways. So I tried to write with that, which was a feeling I felt, right, with that sense of excitement. But you're right, or the implication of your question is right in that, to kind of come back to our earlier question, it is on some level a work of advocacy for print. I think all three of us spend a lot of time persuading literary critics and literature students to look at the physical book. I just did a lecture this morning explicitly on that subject. So it has some of that spirit of, which is why I'm anxious not to kind of clog it with technical knowledge, but to have a sense of things being alive in it. Well, I think that idea of print on demand, super small runs, that's quite a powerful and interesting idea, and takes us back to the early years of printing and even into a manuscript culture, which thought in terms of those terms that preceded prints. And that seems to me potentially interesting. The kind of de-peopling of it is, worrying, I think. But I'm optimistic about the capacities of the book to endure. But we need to talk about your printing. Yeah. Okay.
Good. Well, optimism seems a perfect place to be ending here. I'd like to thank Adam again for both producing this wonderful book and talking about it so eloquently, to Ben for reading and speaking so eloquently, and to all of you for your interest and engagement. And I hope you'll be back for the next Torch book at lunchtime. And thank you to all colleagues from Torch for enabling this event.